In the grand tapestry of European royalty, few figures evoke as much fascination and tragedy as Joanna of Castile, better known to history as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, born on November 6, 1479, in Toledo, Spain. She was the third child of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, the Catholic monarchs who unified Spain under a single crown and launched the infamous Inquisition. Her birthright placed her in the very heart of Spanish dynastic ambition. But even in infancy, no one imagined she would become queen. Her childhood was one of royal expectation and religious rigor. The royal court of Castile was austere and pious. As the daughter of the most powerful monarchs in Christendom, Joanna was subjected to strict Catholic discipline. Her mother, Isabella, was a woman of formidable will, intelligent, forceful, and devout. Joanna, inheriting her mother's sharp intellect, was educated rigorously in languages, philosophy, music, theology, and law. By the time she was a teenager, she was fluent in Latin and deeply familiar with the workings of statecraft and diplomacy. But while her mind was bright, her emotional temperament was sensitive. Reports from her youth describe a serious, introspective girl who was prone to melancholia, what might today be diagnosed as depression. At the time, however, such introspective behavior was viewed as a quirk or worse, a spiritual weakness. Her mother saw it as a sign that Joanna was not suited for political leadership. As a result, she was never trained to rule, unlike her older siblings, Prince Juan and Princess Isabella. Yet fate would have other plans. The very family that was supposed to shield her from the weight of rule would be struck by a series of tragedies. Her elder brother, one, died suddenly in 1497. Then, in 1498, her sister Isabella, heir presumptive after Juan, also died in childbirth. Her son, Miguel, briefly became heir to both Castile and Portugal, but he too died young. With the line of succession shattered, the weight of two kingdoms unexpectedly fell on Joanna's shoulders. But Joanna's story was already intertwined with a foreign power. In 1496, when she was just 16, Joanna was married to Philip the Handsome, Archduke of Austria and son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. The marriage was arranged not for love, but to cement a powerful alliance between Spain and the Habsburg Empire. Still, Joanna's voyage to Flanders was celebrated with pomp. She left Spain a young girl, full of hope, perhaps even in love with the idea of love. The marriage would become the defining relationship of her life, for better and for worse. But the most haunting irony was this: Joanna was never meant to rule. She was a political pawn, married off to support the ambitions of men more powerful than herself. Yet with the death of every sibling ahead of her in the line of succession, her path to the throne was cleared, not through triumph, but through grief. And it was in that grief, paired with betrayal, that the seeds of her so-called madness were sown. At court, whispers grew. She was too emotional, they said, too passionate, too intense. These weren't traits celebrated in queens, especially not in a world that prized obedience and silence in women. And as her story unfolded, these whispers would be used against her, weaponized by a father who feared her independence, a husband who craved her throne, and a son who had no room for his mother in his vision of empire. Her story was not one of insanity, but of being systematically disempowered. And it all began here, in the cradle of royal expectation, in the towering cathedrals of Toledo, under the heavy hand of a mother who taught her faith, but not freedom. At the turn of the 16th century, the royal courts of Europe played a dangerous game of thrones, where marriage was not about love but legacy, and queens were as much political currency as gold or land. Joanna of Castile, then just a teenage princess, found herself swept into this high-stakes arena in 1496. Her marriage to Philip the Handsome, the Archduke of Austria and heir to the powerful House of Habsburg, was a masterstroke of diplomacy, designed to unite two empires against France. But what began as a calculated alliance would erupt into one of history's most emotionally volatile royal unions. Philip, son of Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, and Mary of Burgundy, was the embodiment of courtly perfection, or so the world believed. Tall, golden-haired, charming, and athletic, he was nicknamed the Handsome for good reason. When Joanna arrived in Flanders to meet her husband for the first time, something rare happened between the royal pair. They fell into genuine passion. Accounts of their first meeting describe an almost immediate physical and emotional infatuation. This was no icy political marriage. It was red-hot, intense, and almost obsessive. But passion is a double-edged sword. Joanna's love for Philip bordered on worship, and she soon became emotionally dependent on him. Philip, on the other hand, was far more pragmatic. Though initially enchanted by a Spanish bride, he was also vain, ambitious, and politically shrewd. He enjoyed Joanna's affection, but did not return it with the same depth or fidelity. Within months of their marriage, rumors of his infidelities began to circulate. For Joanna, this was unbearable. Her jealousy grew uncontrollable, and soon so did her behavior. When Philip's mistresses came too close, she reportedly lashed out, both verbally and physically. One chronicler wrote that she had hair of a rival lady-in-waiting cut off in a fit of rage. Another claimed she once struck a lady who she believed had seduced her husband. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories contributed to a growing narrative that Joanna was emotionally unstable, perhaps even mad. But was it madness, or was it the natural reaction of a deeply betrayed young woman, isolated in a foreign land, surrounded by hostile courtiers and a husband who toyed with her affections? Life in the Habsburg court was cold compared to Spain. Joanna struggled with the climate, the language, the culture, and most of all, the politics. Philip's advisors despised her Spanish entourage, and the Spanish in turn distrusted the Flemish court. Joanna was caught between two worlds, with no safe place to stand. Her emotional intensity, which might have been nurtured in a more compassionate environment, was instead magnified and weaponized. Meanwhile, back in Spain, her mother Isabella was growing increasingly alarmed. She heard troubling reports of Joanna's erratic behavior and Philip's disloyalty. The Catholic monarchs began to fear that their daughter might not be fit to rule. In response, Isabella tightened the chain, demanding that Joanna remain loyal to Spanish interests and threatening to revoke her inheritance if she did not comply. This only worsened Joanna's predicament. She was now caught between three powerful forces: a controlling mother, a distant and disloyal husband, and a growing sense of internal turmoil. And then the tide of fate shifted yet again. In a series of tragic events, Joanna's elder brother, sister, and nephew all died, leaving her as the sole heir to the vast Spanish Empire. Suddenly, the passionate young wife had become the future Queen of Spain, and Philip saw his opportunity. Philip didn't want to share power. He wanted to rule, and he quickly realized that Joanna's perceived instability could be a useful tool. If she could be painted as mentally unfit, he could take the crown without opposition. From this moment forward, every emotional outburst, every tear, every plea for affection would be recorded and reported, spun into a narrative of lunacy. What Joanna didn't know was that her love, once her greatest strength, was being turned into her greatest vulnerability. By the time she and Philip returned to Spain in 1502 to be officially recognized as heirs to the throne, cracks were already visible. Philip refused to adopt Spanish customs or defer to local nobility. He undermined Joanna at every opportunity, arguing with her in public and making decisions without her. Even as she was presented to the Spanish Cortes as the future queen, her power was being chipped away behind the scenes. Joanna had entered the marriage as a hopeful princess, but she was quickly becoming a puppet in a game she could neither control nor escape. Her deep, unrelenting love for Philip would soon spiral into obsession, and when tragedy struck, that obsession would become the very weapon used to lock her away. In the palace halls of Flanders and Castile, Joanna was learning the most painful lesson of all. In the world of kings and crowns, love is not a shield, it is a curse. In the grand chessboard of European monarchy, Joanna of Castile had been peripheral piece, a pawn to be moved into advantageous positions for the glory of the crown. But fate had other plans. With each tragic death in her family, the spotlight edged closer until it finally shone solely on her. Joanna, once the overlooked daughter, now stood as heir to the most powerful unified kingdom in Europe. But her ascent wasn't met with triumph. It came cloaked in mourning, tension, and manipulation. It began with the death of her only brother, Prince Juan, in 1497. Just 19 years old and newly married to Margaret of Austria, Philip's sister, Juan's sudden death sent shockwaves through Spain. He had been the great male hope of the Catholic monarchs. handsome, intelligent, and groomed to rule both Castile and Aragon. His death left a gaping hole in succession. Next in line was Joanna's elder sister, Isabella, who had married King Manuel I of Portugal. She was crowned Princess of Asturias, the title reserved for the Castilian heir, but died in childbirth in 1498. Her infant son, Miguel, briefly united the claims of Portugal, Castile, and Aragon, but his death in 1500 shattered that hope. With no direct male heir remaining, Joanna, then just 21 and living in Flanders, became heir presumptive. Suddenly, the woman many dismissed as emotionally fragile was thrust into the center of a dynastic storm. Her parents, Ferdinand and Isabella, were not thrilled by the prospect. They feared that Joanna, deeply attached to her Habsburg husband and surrounded by foreign advisors, would pull Spain under Habsburg control. Philip, meanwhile, saw an empire ripe for the taking. The tragic deaths in Joanna's family offered him the opportunity of a lifetime, the chance to rule Castile and Aragon through his wife. But as the pieces shifted, the question that haunted the court became louder. Was Joanna capable of ruling? Or was she, whispers suggested, mad? The narrative of Joanna's instability began to solidify, not through diagnosis or fact, but through politics. Reports sent to Spain from Flanders emphasize her emotional volatility, her bouts of melancholy, and her fits of jealousy. In many cases, these traits, especially her reaction to Philip's infidelity, were common enough, but in the male-dominated royal courts of Europe, a woman's passion was suspect, her sadness dangerous, her tears damning. In 1502, Joanna and Philip made a royal journey to Spain to be recognized as heirs by the Castilian and Aragonese parliaments. The trip was an opportunity for Philip to assert his presence and secure his future crown. However, it also revealed the fault lines in their marriage and in the political ambitions surrounding them. Ferdinand and Isabella greeted their daughter with warmth, but viewed Philip with increasing suspicion. He refused to take part in many of the traditional Spanish rituals, dismissed local advisors, and sought to assert his own authority independent of Joanna. Worse still, he often acted against her interests, treating her with cold disdain and publicly undermining her. During this visit, Joanna's emotional fragility began to surface more visibly. Torn between loyalty to her parents and devotion to her husband, she began to unravel under the strain. Her mother, Queen Isabella, became deeply concerned. After Philip returned to Flanders without Joanna, she was temporarily confined in a royal estate under the justification that her mental health required rest and protection. This moment was a turning point. It marked the beginning of Joanna's long descent. Not into madness, necessarily, but into political irrelevance carefully masked as medical concern. But Joanna was no fool. She knew that behind her confinement lay fear. Fear of what she might become with full power. Fear that she would place the interests of her husband and the Habsburgs above those of Spain. She was caught in a vice. To be queen, she had to sever her emotional ties to Philip. But to remain Philip's wife, she had to relinquish her political birthright. In 1504, everything changed again. Queen Isabella died, and with her death, Joanna officially became Queen of Castile. It should have been her moment of triumph. Instead, it triggered a power vacuum. Joanna was now sovereign in name, but Philip and Ferdinand both moved swiftly to take control. Her father claimed she was mentally unfit. Her husband demanded to rule in her name. Neither had any intention of allowing Joanna to wield power independently. Thus began the battle for Castile, a battle not fought with swords, but with whispers, decrees, and carefully written accusations. Joanna's grief at her mother's death, her isolation in a foreign court, and her betrayal by those closest to her pushed her further into despair. But still, she resisted. She insisted she was capable of ruling. She argued for her right as queen. She demanded to be heard. But the machinery of monarchy was already grinding her down. She had not yet been imprisoned, not yet labeled incurable. But the narrative was forming, and once it took hold, it would be almost impossible to escape. By 1506, Joanna of Castile stood at the epicenter of a kingdom racked by grief, power struggles, and suspicion. Her mother, Isabella of Castile, was dead. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, was scheming to maintain control. And her husband, Philip the Handsome, had maneuvered himself into the role of king, de facto, if not de jure. Joanna, though queen by inheritance, was politically cornered. And then, fate intervened with one final, devastating twist. Philip died. Philip's death on September 25, 1506, was sudden, shocking, and steeped in rumors. He was just 28 years old. Officially, he succumbed to a fever, possibly typhoid, though some whispered of poison. Theories spread like wildfire across Castile. Had Ferdinand poisoned him to retake control? Had someone in Philip's own court sought to eliminate him to prevent tyranny? Or was it simply the hand of God, intervening in a kingdom spinning out of moral and political control? For Joanna, Philip's death was not just a personal catastrophe. It was a moment her identity shattered. Despite all his betrayals, infidelities, and manipulation, Joanna loved him. Madly, deeply, painfully. His rejection had scarred her, but his death unmoored her completely. And then came the moment that would define her legend forever. After Philip's death, Joanna had his body embalmed and placed in a coffin, but she refused to bury him. Instead, she ordered the coffin kept close to her, and she began a funeral procession that would become one of the most infamous in European royal history. Over the next several months, Joanna traveled from town to town with her husband's corpse, often opening the coffin to gaze at his face. She reportedly believed he might return to life, or at least deserved her unwavering presence. Some accounts say she would only allow women into his presence if they were old or unattractive, fearing that Philip's beauty might still seduce even in death. Others say she whispered to his body at night, speaking to him as if he were still alive. Whether these tales are true or embellished, they cemented the image of Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But beneath this narrative was a much darker reality. Joanna was not simply grieving. She was being erased. With Philip gone and Ferdinand reasserting himself, there was no longer a need to share power. If she was mad, then she could be locked away. If she was a grieving widow lost in delusion, she posed no political threat. The timing of her breakdown, real or exaggerated, was convenient for everyone but Joanna. The funeral procession itself was not just a personal act of mourning. It was also a symbol of defiance. As long as Philip's body was not buried, his death was not truly closed. As long as she was traveling with him, she remained queen, wife of the king. To bury him would be to surrender. To her father, to her enemies, and to the court that whispered constantly about her instability. Ferdinand, observing from afar, realized a political disaster unfolding. If Joanna retained power, the throne could be vulnerable. In 1507, under the guise of protecting his daughter and stabilizing the realm, Ferdinand returned to Castile and had Joanna confined to the royal fortress of Tordesillas, a remote and cold palace where her reign, in any real sense, came to an end. But he did not bury Philip immediately. It wasn't until 1509, 3 years after Philip's death, that Joanna finally allowed his interment at the Royal Chapel in Granada, beside Queen Isabella. By then, she was firmly in the grip of confinement, politically neutered, her grief weaponized as madness. The death of Philip was not just a moment of personal devastation. It was a turning point that allowed the world to entomb Joanna while she still breathed. The woman who had been Queen of Castile, wife to a Habsburg Archduke, and mother to the future Holy Roman Emperor, was now a widow in chains, and, in the eyes of many, no longer fit to rule. But was she truly insane? Or had she simply loved too fiercely in a world that demanded royal women be cold, calculating, and convenient? Even now, centuries later, historians debate what Joanna truly felt in those months after Philip's death. Was she clinging to the last vestige of power, mourning a man who destroyed her, or protesting, in the only way she could, against a life that had never truly belonged to her? Whatever the truth, one thing is clear. The death of Philip the Handsome was a final crack in the fragile glass of Joanna's royal life, and the procession she led, coffin in tow, wrapped in black veils, watched by curious and horrified subjects, was not the beginning of madness. It was a funeral march for her freedom. In 1504, with the death of her formidable mother, Isabella I of Castile, Joanna of Castile became the legitimate Queen of Castile, Queen Joanna I. By law, by lineage, and by the will of her mother, the throne was hers. But history is often unkind to queens who do not conform, and Joanna's reign was less a coronation and more a cancellation. She held the title, yes, but not the power. And slowly, piece by piece, the crown that should have adorned her head was taken from her hands. In the immediate aftermath of Queen Isabella's death, a political storm engulfed Castile. Her will stated clearly that Joanna would inherit the kingdom, but also that Ferdinand, her father, would serve as regent only if Joanna was deemed unfit to rule. That clause became the wedge by which Ferdinand began a campaign to undermine his daughter's authority. The justification? Her supposed madness. Ferdinand claimed Joanna's erratic behavior and emotional instability, especially after Philip's death, rendered her incapable of governing. He positioned himself not as a power-hungry father, but as a concerned patriarch trying to save the kingdom from disorder. But his actions were calculated. Ferdinand had no intention of relinquishing the power he had wielded for decades. And as a man in a patriarchal world, he knew one truth above all: label a woman mad, and no one will listen to her again. For a brief moment, the tides turned. In 1506, Joanna's husband Philip the Handsome had declared himself King of Castile in right of his wife. The Castilian nobility, weary of Ferdinand's control, sided with Philip, thinking him easier to manipulate. But Philip's sudden death just months later shattered that balance. Now Joanna stood alone. Still, she held the legal claim. Still, she was queen. But Ferdinand wasted no time. He returned Castile, declared Joanna incapacitated, and in 1509 ordered her confined in the fortress of Tordesillas. It was here, within thick stone walls, that Joanna's reign would exist in name only for nearly 50 years. Let's be clear, Joanna was never deposed. She continued to be Queen of Castile until her death in 1555. Coins were minted in her name. Proclamations bore her seal. Foreign diplomats addressed her with royal titles. Yet she wielded no real authority. Her voice was silent, her movements restricted, her decisions overridden. She was, quite literally, a queen in a cage, inside Tordesillas. Her life became a shadow of its former self. She was allowed only a small retinue of servants. Her interactions with the outside world were tightly controlled. For a time, she was even denied the ability to bathe regularly, supposedly for her own good. It's unclear how often she was allowed correspondence, but reports suggest that even her mail was censored. When ambassadors visited, they were allowed to see her only under strict supervision, and even then, only for brief moments. Those who did speak with her reported conflicting impressions. Some claimed she was lucid and intelligent, though melancholic. Others described her as distracted and emotionally distant, but none described the raving lunatic that Ferdinand and later her son, Charles V, portrayed. If she was mad, it was a madness cultivated in isolation, nurtured not by nature, but by betrayal and grief. Yet even within confinement, Joanna resisted. She refused to sign certain decrees, unless they met her moral or political standards. She questioned decisions made on her behalf. And, most tellingly, she never willingly abdicated. She knew who she was. Queen of Castile, the rightful heir of Isabella, a monarch in her own right. Her refusal to surrender that title was not the delusion of a madwoman. It was a defiance of a woman who knew the law and knew how it had been bent to break her. Perhaps that's why she frightened them. A passive woman could be managed. A broken woman could be discarded. But Joanna was neither. Even in silence, she held on to her crown. It's worth noting that her confinement was not unique in royal history. Many queens, especially those whose power threatened male rulers, were quietly removed from the political arena under the guise of protection or madness. But few endured it for as long as Joanna did. Nearly half a century in captivity. Half a century as a prisoner with a crown. To the world outside, she was Juana la Loca. But within those stone walls, she remained what she had always been, a queen betrayed by her blood, entombed in her own throne. Tucked away on the banks of the Douro River in central Spain stand the royal convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas, a former palace turned prison for one of Europe's most tragic queens. Here, behind high stone walls and under constant watch, Joanna of Castile would live out nearly 5 decades of confinement. Though she was a crowned queen, her world shrank to a series of dark rooms, whispered prayers, and memories that refused to die. This was not merely a prison of stone. It was a tomb built to betrayal. Joanna arrived at Tordesillas in 1509, under the orders of her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, who claimed she needed protection due to her mental condition. The world was told she was mad, too unstable to rule, too dangerous to leave free. But many suspected the truth. Her confinement was political. With Joanna locked away, Ferdinand could govern Castile without challenge. She was only 30 years old. Her quarters were Spartan. No court, no council, no ceremonies. The halls were silent save for the echo of her steps and the soft shuffle of the guards who monitored her. Joanna was kept under tight surveillance. Her attendants were chosen not for their loyalty to her, but for their loyalty to her jailers. Even her meals were controlled. She was allowed no freedom to leave the premises, and at times, not even freedom to look outside the windows. Even more tragically, Joanna's daughter, the Infanta Catalina, was kept with her, a child growing up in a palace that had become a prison. For years, the two lived a strange, secluded existence. One a child who did not understand the nature of the confinement, the other a mother slowly unraveling beneath the weight of abandonment. Some reports suggest that Joanna would speak to the embalmed heart of her dead husband, which she kept in a small casket, a claim often used to bolster accusations of her madness, though it's just as likely a story exaggerated by those eager to silence her. Despite this isolation, Joanna continued to assert her royal dignity. She insisted on being addressed as Your Majesty. She signed documents carefully and refused to relinquish her title as queen. Those who visited her often noted her composure. A Venetian ambassador described her as grave in demeanor and still of regal bearing. Another visitor claimed she was melancholy, yes, but entirely capable of reasoned conversation. These accounts suggest not madness, but deep sorrow and possibly depression aggravated by imprisonment. When Ferdinand died in 1516, the throne of Aragon passed to Joanna. Technically, she was now queen of both Castile and Aragon, the very union her parents had dreamed of. But rather than being crowned, Joanna was further buried. Her own son, Charles, the future Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, stepped into the power vacuum. At just 16 years old, he began ruling in her name while ensuring she remained locked away. In truth, Charles had even more reason than Ferdinand to keep Joanna hidden. As long as she lived and held the title of queen, his own claim to the Spanish crown was only through regency. Her presence complicated his legitimacy. Therefore, he maintained and even tightened her imprisonment. Guards were instructed to deny her visitors. Her name appeared on royal decrees, but she had no say in the affairs of state. She was the face of the crown, but not its voice. At Tordesillas, time passed slowly. The seasons changed. Monarchs rose and fell. Empires expanded. But Joanna remained. For nearly 50 years, she breathed the same stale air, walked the same corridors, and stared at the same cold walls. And yet, she never abdicated. She never declared herself unfit. She never gave up her crown. Her mental condition remains debated. Some historians argue she suffered from clinical depression or bipolar disorder, possibly hereditary. Others insist she was entirely sane, merely overwhelmed by grief and trauma. What is certain is this: whatever instability she experienced was cruelly magnified by isolation, grief, and political betrayal. As she aged, Joanna's physical health declined. She developed mobility issues and suffered chronic pain. Yet she refused most treatment, distrustful of those sent to care for her. Perhaps she suspected, rightly, that many around her were not there to heal, but to ensure her silence. She outlived her father. She outlived most of her contemporaries. And yet, she never lived freely again. Tordesillas was not just a prison. It was a mirror of the era's fears. A powerful woman, passionate, intelligent, and rightfully queen, had been reduced to a cautionary tale. Her confinement was a message to all others. Defy the order of men, and you too may vanish behind stone walls. And so, the queen remained, entombed in her own throne, remembered not for the power she once held, but for the silence that surrounded her until the very end. The name Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, has echoed through the centuries as both a historical verdict and a cultural myth. It is a label that defined her legacy, the excuse for her imprisonment, and the justification used by those who seized her power. But what lies beneath that name? Was Joanna truly insane, or was her so-called madness a political fiction, a convenient cloak for dynastic ambition? To answer that, we must understand how mental illness was perceived in the 16th century. In a time before psychology, depression, and emotional distress were not treated with compassion or medicine, they were met with suspicion, religious condemnation, or outright fear. For royalty, any hint of irrational behavior was dangerous. A grieving queen could be considered unstable. A strong-willed woman who defied her husband could be declared mad. Joanna was intelligent, by all accounts, exceptionally so. She had received a thorough humanist education, spoke multiple languages fluently, and had a deep understanding of theology, diplomacy, and law. Her early letters and speeches are lucid, articulate, and politically savvy. Yet from a young age, she was described as melancholic and emotionally intense. Some modern historians speculate that she may have suffered from bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, or clinical depression, but there is no definitive diagnosis, and all such theories are retrospective and speculative. What is known is this: her emotional difficulties were repeatedly and strategically exaggerated by those around her. Her mother Isabella first expressed concern over Joanna's religious skepticism and emotional intensity. Her husband Philip capitalized on her passionate love to depict her as hysterical. Her father used her grief to cast doubt on her stability. Her son Charles kept her locked away long after any episodes had passed. In fact, some of the most frequently cited examples of her madness occurred during or after moments of severe trauma: Philip's infidelity, the deaths of her mother and husband, her forced separation from her children. Even her famous procession with Philip's coffin, while certainly unorthodox, can be viewed as a behavior of a deeply grieving widow, especially in an age when mourning rituals were elaborate and theatrical. But in Joanna's case, grief became madness because it was politically convenient. Consider this: if Joanna were truly insane, why did her name remain on royal documents? Why did Charles rule in her name even decades after her imprisonment? Why was she never formally deposed? The truth appears to be more complicated than a clinical diagnosis. Joanna was inconvenient. Her existence challenged the ambitions of her male relatives. As Queen of Castile, she had legal and hereditary authority that could not easily be stripped away. So instead, they stripped away her reputation. They painted her as unstable, locked her away, and used her name while denying her agency. The court at the time was full of whispers and contradictions. Some ambassadors reported that she was lucid and reasonable during their visits. Others described her as withdrawn, angry, or suspicious. But is that madness, or the expected response of someone who had been betrayed by her father, isolated from her children, and imprisoned for speaking her mind? We must also examine how gender played a role. Male monarchs who displayed emotional outbursts or eccentric behavior were rarely labeled insane. Henry VIII executed multiple wives and grew paranoid and tyrannical in his later years. Yet he remained king. Charles VI of France believed he was made of glass and ran screaming through his palace, but was not permanently removed. Women, however, were held to a different standard. A queen was expected to be obedient, modest, and silent. Joanna was none of these. In fact, the traits most frequently used against her, her passion, her grief, her defiance, were the very traits that made her human, not mad. They made her dangerous to men who preferred a compliant figurehead over a woman who knew the law and insisted on her rights. And so, the narrative of madness persisted. It was convenient, it was effective, and it endured. Even today, when we call her Joanna the Mad, we participate in a story that was never hers to tell. We repeat a verdict rendered not by doctors or priests, but by kings and courtiers with too much to gain from her silence. But perhaps it is time to change the name, to call her instead Joanna the Wronged, Joanna the Imprisoned, or Joanna the Queen who Endured, because the greatest madness of all was not within her. It was a system that feared her power, crushed her spirit, and entombed her in her own throne. Joanna of Castile held a throne she could not sit upon. Her name adorned royal decrees, Yet her voice was silenced. She wore a crown and title, yet lived in the darkness of a stone cell. For nearly 50 years, she reigned over Castile not in power, but in shadow. After her father Ferdinand's death in 1516, Joanna technically became the sole monarch of both Castile and Aragon, the first monarch to unite Spain entirely under one crown. But this unprecedented power was never hers to wield. From the moment her mother died, her reign had been undermined. Now, with her father gone, it was her son, Charles of Ghent, later known as Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, who stepped in to continue the quiet coup against her sovereignty. Joanna was queen, but she was also the last obstacle between Charles and absolute control over Spain. At just 16, Charles arrived from the Netherlands with a foreign entourage, a heavy accent, and the ambition to rule an empire. He had barely known his mother. In fact, he had only met her once in childhood and again during brief, stage visits while she was already confined. Rather than seek her guidance or blessing, he quickly declared her mentally unfit, just as his grandfather had before him. And so, the pattern of political erasure continued. Yet Charles was careful. He did not depose Joanna outright. Doing so would risk a crisis of legitimacy. Instead, he ruled in her name, signing laws and forging alliances as Charles, son of Queen Joanna. Her presence on official documents gave his authority weight and continuity. But behind palace doors, Joanna remained invisible, a monarch in print only, not in practice. This arrangement suited everyone at court. Charles was free to govern, and Joanna, locked away in the fortress of Tordesillas, could not intervene. She became a living ghost, her confinement justified by the same tired accusation, madness. But was she truly lost to the world? Despite the isolation, there are glimpses, brief, bright flashes, of the Queen's enduring presence. Visitors occasionally noted that she remained mentally sharp, though melancholic. She refused to sign documents that went against her conscience. She resisted attempts to manipulate her into abdicating. And most tellingly, she never accepted her removal from power. Even more remarkably, she never signed over a crown to Charles. Not once. She maintained her status as queen, even as the world acted like she was dead. In a symbolic sense, Joanna became the living embodiment of suppressed power, a woman whose title was honored only when convenient. Her captors could not erase her legally, so they erased her physically. They let her reign on parchment, but not in flesh. This is the cruel genius of her imprisonment. The Spanish crown needed Joanna to exist, but not to live. She became a symbolic monarch, one whose silence could be interpreted however the ruling powers wished. When peace was needed, they spoke of her gentle piety. When political pressure rose, they whispered of her madness. She was everything and nothing, queen and prisoner, revered and reviled. And in this eerie in-between state, she waited. Years passed. Decades. Empires rose and fell. Charles expanded his dominion across Europe and the New World. Wars were fought. Reformations ignited. The world changed dramatically. But Joanna remained in the same stone cell, her world frozen in 1509. Reports from her later years paint a deeply lonely picture. As she aged, she developed physical ailments, possibly arthritis and mobility issues. Her health declined, though her mind, according to some visitors, remained stubbornly intact. She prayed often, resisted attempts to manipulate her religious beliefs, and even once demanded to be moved from her cell because she suspected the nuns nearby were conspiring against her. It's a tragic irony. Joanna, a queen of the Renaissance, a time of reason, reform, and human dignity, was denied all three. Her own son, the most powerful monarch in Christendom, kept her hidden away like a dangerous relic, while proclaiming to the world that he ruled with divine authority. But perhaps the most haunting part of Joanna's story is this. No one ever truly proved she was insane. No trial, no diagnosis, no confession, only whispers, only shadows. And yet it was enough. Enough to hold her in Tordesillas. Enough to silence her voice. Enough to create a legend that would survive centuries. Joanna's throne was never truly taken from her. It was placed just out of reach, visible, untouchable, and guarded by those she loved most. In the end, Her kingdom became not one of gold or glory, but of silence, a throne of shadows where power was an illusion and loyalty was a curse. On April 12, 1555, in the dim, musty rooms of the fortress palace in Tordesillas, Queen Joanna of Castile, once the heiress to Spain's most powerful dynasty, once the wife of a Habsburg prince and mother of an emperor, drew her final breath. She had lived 75 years, over 45 of them locked away, her title intact but her power stripped. In death, as in life, she remained a paradox, remembered by some as a madwoman, by others as a tragic monarch, and by history as a queen who ruled in name but never in freedom. Joanna's final years were marked by increasing physical and emotional decline. Her isolation deepened, her movement slowed by arthritis, and her body became frail. She reportedly refused to bathe, fearing for her safety, and at times rejected food prepared by those she did not trust. Her world had grown even smaller, consisting of a single room, a small retinue of attendants, and whispers of life she once lived but could no longer reclaim. There were no state visits, no grand courtiers, no messages from foreign kingdoms. While her son, Charles V, stood atop a vast global empire stretching across Europe and the Americas, his mother remained entombed in silence, locked away in the fortress that had become her world. He visited her only once in the final years of her life, a gesture less of affection than political necessity. And yet, even as her strength faded, Joanna never abdicated her title. She never relinquished the crown. In her heart and mind, she remained Queen of Castile, bound to her duty, her lineage, and her faith. Even as the world passed her by, she signed what documents she could, refused to concede authority she legally held, and resisted the manipulation of those who would erase her entirely. There was dignity in her defiance. Quiet though it was, her death was unceremonious. No crowds mourned. No royal proclamation heralded her passing with a fanfare due to a sovereign. Her body, aged and worn from decades of confinement, was taken from the place she had been imprisoned for most of her life and finally laid to rest beside her beloved Philip in Granada, in the royal chapel, as her mother Isabella had once decreed. But even in death, the myths endured. The stories of madness, of necrophilic obsessions, of night terrors, of wild screams echoing down the halls, were passed down like folklore. Some were based on kernels of truth. Many were not. What they all did, however, was cement a narrative. Joanna was not a failed queen, but a mad one. Her tragedy, real and immense, was simplified into spectacle. And so, the real Joanna was buried, twice. Once beneath stone in the royal chapel, and once beneath centuries of myth. But if we look closer, we see not madness but methodical erasure. Her illness always appeared most intense during times of political upheaval. When her husband sought control of Castile, when her father wanted to maintain his regency, when her son needed a clear path to empire. When she complied, the rumors quieted. When she resisted, they grew louder. Even in the 21st century, historians continue to debate whether Joanna was truly insane. The conclusion many reach is both devastating and illuminating. Perhaps she wasn't mad at all, but merely inconvenient. In the end, Joanna's death closed a chapter of history marked by betrayal, grief, and confinement. But it also raised enduring questions about power, gender, and the cost of being a woman in a world designed to silence them. Her life stands as a case study in how political systems crush inconvenient voices, and how easily history can rewrite the truth in the language of madness. She never led armies. She never issued great reforms. She never ruled from a throne. But in her refusal to renounce her crown, to surrender to the stories spun around her, Joanna preserved something more powerful than any kingdom, her rightful identity. She was Queen of Castile, in name, in law, and in spirit. She died not mad but martyred. As the centuries passed and the name, Juana la Loca, took root in European memory, the woman beneath the myth became harder to see. The label mad was easy to remember, tragic, dramatic, and sensational. But the truth of Joanna of Castile, the woman, the daughter, the queen, and the prisoner, is far more complex, far more human, and ultimately far more tragic. Stripped of politics, Joanna's story is one of emotional torment, maternal devotion, betrayal at every turn, and above all, resilience. Born into the powerful union of Ferdinand and Isabella, she was never expected to inherit the throne. As the third child, Joanna was raised with a rigorous humanist education. Steeped in theology, philosophy, and languages, her mind was sharp, her spirit intense, and her inner world rich. What historians sometimes overlook is that Joanna was not born mad. She was made into a madwoman, sculpted by grief, shaped by isolation, and silenced by design. She loved deeply, perhaps too deeply in a world that equated female emotion with weakness. Her marriage to Philip the Handsome began in passion and collapsed under betrayal. Her love for him was not just romantic, but existential. He represented the only sanctuary in a world where her parents treated her like a pawn, and later, her children treated her like a ghost. His infidelity, his political ambitions, and ultimately his death were blows from which Joanna never fully recovered. But was that madness or simply unbearable sorrow? Joanna was also a devoted mother. Her letters, many now preserved, expressed deep affection and concern for her children, particularly Charles. Her longing to be part of their lives, to guide them as any mother would, was repeatedly denied. Even as queen, she had no right to raise her own family. They were taken from her, raised by strangers, and turned into tools of the very dynasty that confined her. Still, through it all, Joanna refused to relinquish her identity. Despite the decades and tordesillas, the humiliations and the calculated isolation, she never abdicated. She was Queen of Castile in law and belief, and she never signed away her sovereignty, no matter the pressure. That quiet act of resistance, holding onto her crown in silence, became her most powerful legacy. Her supposed madness, as we now see it, becomes suspect when viewed in political context. It first emerged when she began questioning her husband's advisors. It deepened when she challenged her father's authority. It became irreversible when her son needed her throne. At every stage, the diagnosis came not from doctors, but from ambitious men. In her later years, even those who met her found her dignity intact. Some ambassadors remarked on her composed speech, her awareness of current events, and her spiritual intensity. They noted sadness and suspicion, but not insanity. One even said, "The queen is more sane than those who keep her locked away." The tragedy of Joanna is not just that she was confined, but that she was erased while still alive, a living monarch, with her name on coins and decrees, but barred from court, from politics, from even speaking her truth. And yet she endured. When we peel back the layers of myth, we find not madness, but mourning, not delusion, but defiance, not weakness, but a quiet and unwavering will. Joanna of Castile survived the betrayals of her husband, the usurpation by her father, the abandonment by her children, and the judgment of history itself. Her story forces us to ask, how many other women in history have been labeled mad, difficult, or dangerous simply because they refuse to conform? How many queens, thinkers, mothers, and daughters have had their voices stolen under the guise of protection? Joanna's life speaks to every woman who has been silenced, misdiagnosed, or dismissed. She is a cautionary tale, yes, but also a symbol of how much strength it takes to keep hold of your truth when everyone around you tries to rewrite it. She was never crowned in a grand coronation. She never ruled from a throne in a glittering palace. But Joanna was a queen of memory, of endurance, of unbreakable identity. And perhaps, just perhaps, it's time we stop calling her Joanna the Mad and start calling her what she always was. Joanna the Forgotten Queen, who refused to be forgotten. Was Joanna truly mad, or was her madness manufactured? Subscribe to the Crit Stories and uncover the truth hidden in the shadows of history.